Morning, Divisions 1 and 2. We're going to do another figure of speech this week, as promised, called Idiomatic Expressions or idioms. So for those of you writing notes, here you go. This particular lesson is going to be a little bit longer because there's several parts to it. The good news is it's usually one of the most fun. It's the one that kids like the most. I'm actually disappointed we're not at the school right now because some of the projects we normally do with idiomatic expressions are a lot of fun. They're very creative and they let you be artistic as well. So I'm going to leave the door open for you for this assignment to kind of do a little bit of what you'd like, have fun with it. We'll talk about that in a bit. So you most likely will need to, if you haven't been taking notes, you should take notes for this one because it's a little bit more complex than some of the other ones. So an idiom or an idiomatic expression is an expression that is understood by the people who are listening to it. However, it means something other than its literal meaning. So you say something, but you mean something completely different, but it's understood by the people speaking. So here you go. You want to pause and write that down. I have a special note there that these can be very difficult for second language learners. If that applies to you, if English is not your first language, keep in mind this one might be a little bit harder for you. For people who have grown up speaking English, these idiomatic expressions that we're going to study, you have probably heard many times before and you have very likely used them yourselves. But when you learn a new language, just about every language has idiomatic expressions. When you learn a new language, it's hard. You don't know what people are talking about until someone tells you what it means. So keep that in mind. There might be a few of you that find this a little harder. Here we go. Next note. Pause and write it down. So a lot of idiomatic expressions have their roots in history. And others are common. They've been kind of created very recently and they're still understood. So we're going to start with the common idioms. So these are the more recent ones. So I'm going to give you an example here. Common idiom number 1, she's driving me up the wall. So what this actually means is she's really annoying. She's bothering you. She's not getting into a car, turning the ignition and driving the car up the side of the wall. That's ridiculous. We all know that. But when you hear this expression, she's driving me up the wall, it's understood that she's being annoying or bothersome. And just about anybody who heard that would understand. Imagine if you're coming from a different country and just learning English for the first time, and someone said, "Oh, that girl is driving me up the wall." You'd be like, "What? Where? With a bicycle? With a car? How do you do that? How? That's not possible." So there's an example of how things would be difficult for a second language learner. All right, I'm going to give you a couple more common idioms. These are day-to-day ones. So Elvis has left the building. The meaning of this is the show is over, the spectacle is over, there's nothing left here here to see. Well, obviously Elvis was never around to begin with, obviously. What it means is that whatever was exciting or cool has ended. So this expression, this idiomatic expression, might get used maybe in an actual performance, like a singer or a comedian, but also just anything else that has drawn people's attention in. Elvis Presley was one of the most popular artists of all time. So it is understood that people were paying attention to something really, really special. So imagine you're on the side of the road and there's a whole bunch of cars gathering because someone saw a bear and her cubs. That's something that tends to draw people's attention. And the bears have now gone into hiding and you can't see them anymore. And people are still going, and everyone's gathering around. Someone says, "Okay, Elvis has left the building." What that person means is there's nothing left to see. But at one point, something pretty special was going on. Here is a third common idiom, and this one is actually special because it's one that's evolved. People from my generation would say this. From your generation, you guys do it a little differently. To hit the nail on the head. When you say to hit the nail on the head, what you mean is you got it exactly correct. That was bang on. That was perfect. So that's what people from my generation or older would say. When you get something perfect, you'd say, you hit the nail on the head. Obviously, there's no hammer and nail. But if you've ever worked with a hammer and nail, you know you have to do it pretty accurately for it to work. If you hit it on an angle, the nail might bend. It'll still work, but it's not ideal. To actually get the nail in smoothly, you have to hit the nail right on the head and centered. Otherwise, it doesn't work nearly as well. So this is an idiomatic expression, a common one, which means you did it right. Now, I really like this example because it's one that's involved. What do you guys say? Nailed it. And in fact, I might even do that too. And in fact, I think that's the comment I wrote on some of your English assignments was nailed it. And you can see with that example how idiomatic expressions have in fact evolved. Again, put yourself in the position of someone coming from another country learning English for the first time. And they come to you with their math and they say, I'm not sure if I've got this. And you went, nailed it? They'd probably say, there's no hammer. You guys are weird. So there you go, idiomatic expressions. These ones are common. Now we're going to talk about the really fun one, which is historical idioms. I'm bringing this up second because many of you, without realizing it, used a historical idiom when we were talking about hyperboles, the deliberate exaggerations that we had a while back. In fact, about 5 or 6 of you used an idiomatic expression in place of a hyperbole, and I made a note saying, hang on to this, we're going to use it later. Now we're going to use it. So here's a historical idiom. It's raining cats and dogs. So it is understood that when someone says, oh, it's raining cats and dogs, that what they mean is it's raining very heavily out there. There's a lot of water falling from the sky. And this is probably why many of you thought that this idiomatic expression was in fact a hyperbole. But it's not. It's an idiomatic expression that has its roots in the medieval times, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So let's backtrack to the hyperbole. So why is it that people would have thought it's raining cats and dogs is an exaggeration as opposed to an idiomatic expression? It's because you all immediately understood the meaning of the idiom, which is it's heavily raining. So the example I gave you, how you could take that same idea of heavy rain and give it an unrealistic exaggeration was, it's raining so hard I need my scuba diving gear. Well, that's an impossible exaggeration. Scuba diving gear implies that you are completely submerged in water. That would never happen. I suppose Fort McMurray is a bit of an exception right now, unfortunately. Although even then, it wasn't over your head. So by saying, it's raining so hard, I need my scuba diving gear, now you have an unrealistic exaggeration. That's a hyperbole. Let's go back to, it's raining cats and dogs. This is an idiomatic expression, and it's a historical one. It has its roots in the medieval times. Well, obviously there's no animals falling from the sky, and my note was, or was there? Here's the thing, back in the medieval times, the majority of people didn't live in large houses and castles and even manor houses. The majority of the people were peasants, and they lived in huts that they created from wood and tree branches and leaves and things like that. You might have studied a little bit of that in your social studies class in grade 7 and grade 8. So, what would happen during heavy rains? And thinking about medieval England is very much like the Lower Island. It's a very wet place. So in the winter times, they would very often experience very, very, very heavy rains. When the rain got so heavy that it was unbearable, the animals would look for shelter, obviously. And the smaller animals, most farm areas would have cats and dogs. Dogs would be used for herding. Cats are excellent to have around farms because they hunt mice. So most households, even though they were quite poor and barely scraping by, would have cats and dogs around. So the cats and dogs, of course, were probably not allowed in the house when they were soaking wet. So they would look for shelter within the structure of the house. Many of them would hide up in those grassy roofs. But if the rain was incredibly heavy, they would slide out. So looking out the side of the, what you would call a window, although it probably wasn't made of glass, it wasn't uncommon during heavy rains to see a small animal falling from the roof. And that's where the expression, "it's raining cats and dogs," came from. Because hundreds of years ago in the medieval times, when it was raining really heavily, dogs and cats actually did fall from the sky. Now, there's so many others that have their roots in history, and it's actually loads of fun to study. In fact, it's hilarious, and I would encourage you to research some. So that brings me to assignment number 5. You're going to have a couple choices here. You're going to get to do a creative piece or a writing piece. Now, I'm very disappointed that we're not at the school right now because the creative pieces we did were so much fun. One of the things we did was students would research an idiomatic expression that had its roots in history, and they would explain it, and they would somehow visualize it, whether it was with a beautiful drawing of their own or something that they had created digitally, and explain it. All this would be presented on a nice sort of 8x10 piece of paper, which we kind of mounted on colored paper, and we put them up in the hallways for the grade 5 Welcome to Journey Night. Obviously, that's not happening. But this is something you might like to do. And if that's the case, go ahead and do it. The other thing that we would do with common idioms, as opposed to historical idioms, is we would have a whole bunch of them, dozens of them actually, written on little pieces of paper. And you would be in little groups of 4 or 5, and you would act out a skit, which had a whole bunch of these as required lines. You got to be creative with who the characters were, what they were doing, what they were up to, but you would choose about 4 or 5 of these idiomatic expressions by pulling them out of a hat, and you had to find a way to create a scene that had all of these lines in it, and these lines are common idioms. Common idioms like, "she's driving me up the wall," or "Elvis has left the building," and of course there's hundreds and hundreds more. And you could also add in a few that I didn't ask for. Obviously, we can't get together in groups of 5 to do skits, but you could write a little play or story using as many common idioms as you can. Common idioms, usually when they're acted out, are pretty hilarious. Another creative piece, you can draw a picture that includes a whole bunch of idiomatic expressions in it, and people have to guess what the idiom is. Because they mean something other than their literal meaning, when you see it in picture form, it is hilarious. Now imagine your little sister who's really annoying you in her little, what do you call those things? Yeah, anyway, you guys know what I'm talking about, little plastic cars. Now imagine that plastic car being driven up the wall, dragging you behind. That would be a very funny picture to paint. And it would also be confusing at first. People would have to stop and think about it. Like, what is going on there? Oh, the sister is annoying her. I get it. So you can try drawing several idiomatic expressions and give them to someone else in your household to guess what they mean. And if you're going, "Well, Mrs. Burns, I'm not the creative person, I'm not the artist, can't do this, especially not with other people around to help me out," then you can do a writing piece. So create a little short story and get in as many idiomatic expressions, both historical and common, as you can. You don't have to explain them, just make the story make sense. And throw in so many that you've almost bombarded it. That's the funny part, is being bombarded with these idiomatic expressions rather than literal meaning. And you shouldn't have to explain it, it'll always be understood. So those are some choices for you. Obviously, this is a little longer. Take your time with it, don't race to get it done. Try and have fun. This is usually the most fun project we do in English and grade 8 English. So I'm really sorry I can't be in the class to help you out. But be creative and have fun. Take care.